inFOyer. Gespräche zur Frauenordination in der SELK.
Good evening, dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to the 10th edition of inFOyer, talks about women's ordination in SELK and other churches. My name is Michael Sommer. I belong to Initiative Frauenordination, that is, Initiative for the Ordination of Women, in a rather small German evangelical Lutheran church named SELK, Selbstständige Evangelisch-Lutherische Kirche. We are committed to making it possible for women to become pastors in our church because it corresponds to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the teachings of the Bible. Now, in this talk format, we present people from different churches all over the world and their experience with women's ordination. My guest today is Professor Mary Todd. Good evening from Germany and good morning, I think it's still morning, at Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Good morning.
Hey, our topic is the history of the big sister of our small church, namely Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod. People usually just say Missouri Synod, but before we delve into this vast sea of history, I'd briefly like to introduce you, Mary. Please correct me if I make mistakes, will you?
I would.
Fantastic.
You won't.
Okay. Mary, you are the daughter of a Lutheran pastor and were born into the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod. As it often happens, one of your elder brothers also was an LCMS pastor. Your profession, however, is that of a historian. You did your BA at Valparaiso University, Indiana, your master's degree at Roosevelt University, Chicago, before changing over to the University of Illinois at Chicago for your PhD. The topic of your dissertation was actually the one that you then developed into your book, Authority Vested, which I'm holding up right here. It is a study of the history, identity, and change in the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod. You taught at Concordia University at River Forest, which is one of the LCMS institutions of higher education, but left that university and indeed the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod in 2004. After that, you worked at Ohio Dominican University and at Marshall University at Huntington, West Virginia, before becoming executive director of a National Collegiate Honor Society. Nowadays, you enjoy the active life of a retired scholar and live at Baton Rouge, I already mentioned it, in Louisiana, and you are affiliated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.
Well done.
So far, so good? Okay. Yeah, fantastic. I need to mention, of course, hello to all the people outside there in the world. You are invited very warmly to share into our conversation by posting comments, by posting questions in the live chat, if you'd like to. Now, you spent your formative years as the daughter of the Missouri Synod. Can you share some memories with us, Mary?
Thank you for the invitation to participate in this series with you, Michael. I'm grateful to be able to offer whatever perspective I can to the topic of the ordination of women. So in terms of any background, I've always referred to myself as something of a church brat, meaning I grew up in a Lutheran parsonage next door to the church in Chicago where my father was pastor. And as a very late child, my 5 siblings who were all leaving home at the time I came along. I ended up tagging along with my parents to church events, even on occasional pastoral calls with my father. Mm-hmm. And my parents often entertained clergy friends. And so I would overhear these conversations and develop this curiosity about the church that they were always talking about. In 1962, the church held its convention in Cleveland, where we had moved by that time. My father was very involved in the planning of that, and I became a teenage volunteer for the business meeting of the church, which was a real opportunity to see the church at work in a very different setting than just being living next door to one and participating in our local activities. So my church nerdiness just became enhanced as time went on, and eventually led me to the question that I raised about understanding my church's position on women. One other thing I should add is that my formation as a Lutheran Christian was very much the result of my parents, and my father taught me to live in and still love the church, and my mother taught me how to walk with God, and it's been a gift to have that kind of influence in my life.
Absolutely, yes, I share that, Mary. Okay, thank you for these personal impressions of your early life. I now have this mental image of you as a toddler sitting on the church floor somewhere, or sitting on the living room floor with the pastors around you. Yes, of course, that is so.
I will tell a funny story if you don't mind. When I was in about the third grade, I was attending a local primary school that I would walk to, and my father told me that I was going to go to a parochial school, to a Lutheran school, because the church had entered into an agreement with another Lutheran church. And I was not one bit interested in riding a school bus or in going to that Lutheran school. But of course I did. And I must say the couple of years that I spent there were an additional, very, very influential aspect of my growth as a young Lutheran, memorable teacher, and then that was enhanced by my undergraduate years at Valparaiso, of course. Yeah,
we'll come back to the institutions of education that the church is entertaining. Now, let me start into our topic with a little joke. How many Oxford students does it take to change a light bulb?
Change?
Yeah, you knew it. Yeah, perfect.
That's right.
I had the pleasure of spending 2 years abroad at Oxford as a student. And yes, that is a very conservative place, and a little comparable in that maybe with the LCMS, and of course with SELK as well, my own church. So our topic today is LCMS in relation to women's rights in church and women's ordination. Although women still aren't allowed to become pastors in this church, in many other respects, the role of women has changed substantially over the last 170 years in a church that is increasingly convinced that its teachings are changeless. Learning about these historical developments can help us to understand the present situation and maybe even draw some conclusions that help us to shape the future. We shall see. So what we do is look at a couple of turning points now in the history of LCMS with your help, Professor Todd. You're the expert. Now, first question. LCMS and SELK actually share some historical roots. They have some historical developments in common in the first half of the 19th century. Namely, in the year 1838, 665 people from Saxony, at the time a kingdom in Germany, emigrated to the US, led by a pastor called Martin Stephan. Why did a couple of hundred people leave their home country to go to the US? What were their main reasons for doing so?
The early 19th century in Germany was experiencing a theological movement called confessionalism that rose up in response to the rationalism of the Enlightenment. The immediate threat, though not to the Saxons, but the immediate threat in Germany was the decision of the king in 1817 to form something called the Prussian Union, in which the Lutheran and the Reformed churches would be united. Now, that didn't affect the pastor in Dresden, who is at the heart of this story, Martin Stephan, but he was a confessionalist, and he was wanting to resist the liberal tendencies that he saw developing on the continent. And he saw emigration as the only way to really resist that. So he had a following of several young pastors and some laymen, several attorneys, and others. And they organized an emigration that left Bremen in November of 1838 and traveled to New Orleans, where they arrived in early January 1839, eventually taking a steamboat up the river, the Mississippi River, to St. Louis, Missouri, and settling in the southeast part of the state. It was a unique organization, this operation, and it was funded by the members of the emigration pooling their resources into something called the Credit Fund, which was to cover all of their expenses.
Yes, and now let me just repeat that for clearness' sake. This congregation of people that Martin Stephan had collected around himself, the clergy as well as the lay people, they formed a kind of congregation in Germany, and they feared liberal tendencies. They weren't actually persecuted by church authorities or anything of the kind. No, they had, Martin himself had some trouble with state authorities, isn't that right?
Yes, he was an interesting character. He was a bit of a rogue. He did not have high regard for civil law, and he was under pretty constant observation by the local civil authorities. He particularly was being watched because he was holding what are called conventicles, small group meetings, and which were against the law. And he was also accused of immoral conduct with young women. And so the emigration was for Stephan his means of escaping this oversight that he was experiencing and he was pushing up against. But by the time the emigration left, he was under house arrest and had to get permission from the king to actually leave the country.
Interesting, isn't it?
So on board the ship, a couple months into the voyage, Stephan decided to have himself declared bishop. Now, again, there were 5 ships. One of them had been lost at sea, and so he could only effect this change on the ship that he was traveling. But when they reached America, the rest of the passengers were asked to sign on to this provision that declared Stephan a bishop. And what he was saying was that the community going forward would be an episcopacy, a hierarchical governance system with him as the primate, as they called it, or the bishop. And that was how things were to be operated as they moved north into the Missouri wilderness and began to establish their community. Now, the story takes an interesting turn at that point, because while people were in St. Louis and waiting for the permanent settlement to be identified and begun, the people began to notice Stephan's behavior, similar to what they had heard about but denied in Germany. And some young women stepped forward and to share with the clergy some experiences that they had. And so the clergy got together and decided to go ahead.
They had been harassed by Stephan.
That's one way of saying it, yes. And so the clergy got together and decided that they needed to excommunicate the bishop.
Yeah.
And they offered him 3 choices. One was to stand trial in America. One was to return to Germany. And the third choice was to be rowed across the river to the state of Illinois and be sent into exile. And that was the third was the choice that Stephan picked. And that's what happened. And when he left, after he left, they learned that the credit fund was virtually empty.
That must have been a shock, yes. So,
well, yes, it was a shock, and it sent them into a bit of a tailspin for 2 years at least. They were in a high state of despair because they wondered, without a bishop, are they a church? Without a leader, was their travel even legitimate? Should they go back to Germany? What should they do, except that they had no resources by which to do so? And I can't imagine the frustrations. The pastors didn't know if they had calls any longer. The people didn't know if they had a right to call themselves a church.
Yeah. And now something interesting happens. Well, it's explicable if you know about the background here. They've had this incredible trouble with a person they trusted in, the bishop that they confided in. The money was gone, he was gone, and now the decision that they make is they want to stay, and they form a community and a church body that is congregationalist. Now, maybe for people at home, we need to explain this term a little. Congregationalist means that the individual parishes basically make the important decisions in the church. For example, in the US, a congregationalist church body, a big congregationalist church body would be the Southern Baptist Convention. In Germany, one of the predecessor churches actually of SELK, which was called, let me see, Evangelisch-Lutherische Freikirche, also was a congregationalist church body. And that is interesting because it was highly unusual at the time. Lutheran churches were no congregationalist church bodies at that time. They had powerful men basically at the top, usually in the form of bishops, in the form of church boards, in the form of pastors who had a say. But after the experience the emigrants from Saxony had made, they decided, no, we are going to stay. We are forming a church, a convention of some kind, and it's going to be the parishes who've got the say, who are the decision makers in this church body. Is that right?
Yes, but let's back up a little bit to say how they got to that point. During by the end of this couple of years of living in a great state of distress, the laymen who were part of the organization issued a manifesto and said, we need to repent and return to Germany. This has been an illegitimate aberration, and there is no other Stefan, and we just need to go. And so they held a debate in the community, and the youngest of the pastors, a man named C.F.W. Walther, spoke on behalf of the clergy, and issued a series of theses that on the church and ministry to respond to the manifesto and to say, no, indeed, we are a church. By word and sacrament and by our common confession, we have the right to call ourselves a church. He never mentions the episcopacy that Stefan had established. Instead, in a nod to the laymen and their real focus on the Luther's priesthood of all believers, they said that the locus of authority of the church was in the congregation, and thus the beginning of what you are calling a congregational polity. And so that seemed to settle the question. Some of the lay people still went back to Germany, but the remainder of these folks stayed put. And Walther himself went to St. Louis to become pastor of the Trinity Church there. And he immediately started a publication called Der Lutheraner that he sent out in search of other confessional Lutherans in America. And in the course of the next few years, he was able to identify 16 congregations who by 1847 came together to form the German Evangelical Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states.
Yes.
And that was the formation of the synod. Now, the synod was to be advisory, again, with the authority in the congregation. And again, in a nod to the layman, the leadership of the synod was going to be dominated by clergy, but with the one office reserved for a layperson, and that was the office of treasurer. That's a curious heritage of that story.
Yeah, and for obvious reasons. so a lay person to have control over the finance of the congregations. Yes. Thank you for explaining that. And of course, Konrad Ferdinand Wilhelm Walter is the name that we associate with the origin of Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod. And if you look onto the website of Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod, the history starts with him and not with Martin Stephan. Yeah, so
that's right. Yes,
the first part is excluded. Yeah, that was not too glorious. It was rather the shipwreck of the original idea of emigrating from Germany, but from that spun or originated the idea, the special organization of the church. And he then, as you said, collected by his publication especially other evangelical Lutheran congregations and added them to the Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod, as it was not called at the time. Sorry, I forgot the correct name you just mentioned it, Deutsche.
The German Evangelical, I'm not going to say it in German, but the German Evangelical Lutheran Church of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. Yes. And I will just say, they only spoke German because they believed that the faith was conveyed only best in the language of Martin Luther.
Yes, yeah, it was also probably quite a closed group, but at the time, of course, many languages were spoken, and English was not by any means as dominant as it was today in the then states of the now US. Yeah. So Walter became the dominant figure of the first decades, basically, of LCMS. And isn't that curious? He was the one who introduced the thought of a congregationalist church body in order to save the project, to at all make it possible for them to stay in the US, to stay together. But then he was a very dominant leader, wasn't he?
He was. He remained president he was the first president of the synod, and he remained president for 40 years until his death. That's a lot of control, one would say.
Yes, and a lot of influence, of course, on the formation of that church. Now, let's come to one of the interesting things about the LCMS, which actually is different from, for example, SELK and other German churches, and that is starting in the 19th century, LCMS has been running a great number of schools as well as several colleges and universities. By the beginning of the 20th century, more and more female teachers were employed by the church. Now, this seems like a logical and reasonable development. We know that especially the teaching profession was one that was open to women early, because people thought, well, yes, they can deal with children, why not educate children, why not in school? But why did that cause theological problems to have female teachers in schools and higher education institutions?
It's a very valid question. The Saxons believed in that a congregation needed to establish a school at the same time it founded, very early in its and so even in Perry County, where in Missouri, where they were settled, there was a school, and it is very much a Missouri Synod tradition that a congregation would have a parochial school attached. And part of that early emigration, not only were there clergy, but there were male teachers. And so the relationship between the ordained clergy and the teachers has always been a bit of a contested notion in the history of the Synod. So that gets only more complicated when women come into the picture in the 1920s. But pastors' wives were serving in that role in many cases, and other women who, as in response to the changes in American society and opportunities opening up, and men not wanting to necessarily stay in that profession, more women became involved over the course of the century, of the next several decades. This issue just never was completely well resolved. And so let's jump ahead to the 1960s, when finally federal regulations from the American government, in particular tax laws, established the right of women to be teachers of the church. Teachers had a divine call, but it was not a call to, I should say male teachers had a divine call. It was not a call to ordained ministry. And there was some discussion of ordaining men to a ministry of the word, but still, what do you do with the women? And so in an adaptation and an accommodation to the tax laws, the issue was settled as to women's status in the teaching profession. It continues to be an issue in terms of I have a friend who is a retired Missouri Synod school teacher. The principal of the school has always been a male. And so there is always that notion of who might women teach? Might they teach boys but not men? And how is that understood? That's part of the whole story of how the Synod understands various elements of its ministry. But I think it should be noted that the question of the doctrine of ministry has been at the root of these various and the controversial nature of them.
Let me just ask one thing for clarification, Mary. I understand this correctly. Now, in the discussion about women's ordination, there's always one of the many Bible quotations that are often referred to are the places in which it is said in the epistles of Paul that women cannot teach. And what is meant there is that they cannot preach, basically. Yeah, they cannot teach in the community, in the congregation in a church meeting, basically. That is how it is usually translated in our church. That it doesn't, in our context, nobody would have the idea that this is related to teaching. What do I know? History in a school, or German, or literature, or whatever. Why is this relevant to teachers who are not teaching religion?
Well, again, it's simply a question of who, back to the notion of authority, Michael.
Yeah.
So, and the question of definition. How do we we're going to get into this in a few minutes, I'm sure, when we talk about women's suffrage.
Yes.
But what is the authority of a teacher over the students? And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was determined that women could teach boys, but not men. So up to a certain grade level, and then they needed to have male teachers. A woman's authority extended only so far. In line with that Pauline prescription of she shall not speak in the church, and how do we understand that? Is that teaching, preaching, and if so, teaching whom?
So this is basically a very, very narrow interpretation of what is allowed to a woman, basically, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so and you mentioned just a minute before that things change. Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod was very reluctant to admit women to teaching jobs, especially when they were given authority over other teachers, over male teachers. That was a problem. And things changed only when federal law in the US changed, and tax law basically was the reason, wasn't it?
Correct.
Yeah. So at that time, Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod was forced to give women basically the same status and the same responsibilities as male teachers.
It finally conceded that, yes. in the
So,
mid 1960s.
so in that case, that would be an example of how the very narrow understanding and interpretation of those Bible places, those Bible quotations, obviously was developed into another understanding by by a social change, basically. Because that was a change from outside. That was nothing that the church decided by itself, wasn't it?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, so interesting form of development there. And but nowadays, you mentioned schools, LCMS schools, but you were a professor, for example, at one of the colleges of the church. And
I was, yes.
Yeah. And nowadays, it is possible for women to teach and to teach everybody there.
Yes, but I just think that is not as provocative a situation as the ordination of women, which will become part of the conversation. There's a convergence of discussions going on in the 1960s with the social change that is happening in the United States. A lot of rights-based groups are forming up. So you find students speaking up, you find women speaking up with the forming organizations. And there is an external pressure to the church that has not been present before. And so women are writing to get some clarity on this. If we have been granted the vote in civil elections,
yes,
why may we not vote in our congregations? And the church had always, for its first century at least, depended on the seminary faculty to answer such questions. But in the early 60s, the church established a commission on theology and church relations, to which such questions were directed. And the continual question seemed to be coming from people who were being vocal about this, women in particular, wanting to know why they could not participate as they knew women did in other churches. So we look at the story of I think that's critical to look at the story of women's suffrage in the Synod, because it had been a continual question that had been cast aside, studied and cast aside more times than not. By the mid-50s, the committee, that was prior to that commission, but the committee that was studying women's suffrage was supposed to report to a convention as to what it had understood. And one of the members of the committee had been traveling in Europe and had discovered a dissertation from an Austrian pastor whose name was Zerbst, that made a case that he thought might help their thinking.
Yes.
And so he translated this document and brought it back to his colleagues. And the root of the thesis that he found was something called the order of creation, that Zerbst was arguing that this was, and this Zerbst was writing in response to the growing number of ordinations of women in the post-war years in Europe. And so he was responding against that. And so to say there is an order of creation that prevents and provides an understanding of authority that prohibits women from serving in ordained ministry. So this concept, however, is not a Lutheran concept. It's a Reformed concept. But indeed, the Synod commission, the committee of pastors, decided that that was going to be sufficient for them to, again, say women may not vote.
Yes.
Interestingly, this order of creation has now become the official basis for understanding the role of women in the Missouri Synod, and it has taken on a life of its own in a sense from this original discovery that was made some 60 years ago.
Yeah.
So
let me just repeat that, because it's so
jump in
important.
here.
It's so important.
Mhm.
So this Austrian theologian called Zerbst, he had developed this idea, der Schöpfungsordnung, order of creation, in his dissertation, and that was by an accident, by chance, discovered by this theologian from LCMS and introduced in his church, and then it went big, didn't it? I mean, this was a concept that was not. I mean, it came very handy after the Second World War, when women were demanding more rights and asking about their rights, and it was then a new discovery of very conservative theologians to say, we've got a formula here which explains everything we always knew but didn't know how to put into words. It is a new theological invention, basically, isn't it?
That's one way to describe it. That's certainly true. Now, it did not prevent women from gaining the right to vote, however, because in the next decade after the discovery of this document or this concept, women continued to press the issue. And so that in 1969, the Synodical Convention agreed that women should have the right to vote. And the popularity of that really took hold very quickly. By the 1970s, the congregation that I was a member of decided that women could be elders in the church, which of course is affiliated with the pastoral office. So that's been controversial in many cases. But people were waiting for this, so the right to vote. But again, we'll go back to, on what basis did the Synod decide this? And again, it was definition. The vote, once the vote was decided that it did not inherently grant anyone authority over anyone else, then it was okay to let people vote. So again, it was definition and the notion of authority. And once that was, unlike the teachers that we were speaking of, and unlike the ordained ministry that we will be talking about, that's key to understanding why certain things were allowed and why other things were not.
Yeah, but it was obviously, theologically speaking, hard work to adapt the concepts of authority to the idea of democracy in the church, as I understand it.
Yes.
Yes. You mentioned a seminary committee in the early 60s who worked on that. Maybe it wasn't.
It was a commission on theology and church relations. Yes, it was appointed a group eventually with some members elected to it as well. But it became the location for the determination of opinions that previously had been granted by seminary faculty. Everyone looked to the faculty for those answers in something called Gutachten. But now it became the work of this commission that was to have both clergy and lay members, and they would be the ones who would study this, any issue that came to them.
So maybe we can come later to the role of experts, of theologians in the church, that they play in decisions with the church today. But anyway, what we've got to pinpoint is at the beginning of the 20th century, it was unthinkable that women should vote in parishes, in congregations, in any decisions that belong to the church, because the thinking was, the man is making the decision for the family, or he's voting for the family. But this had changed by this synodal decision at the end of the 60s, and by the 80s, I think by the 1980s, women were allowed to vote in 80% of the parishes of LCMS. Another substantial change in the role of women and in the understanding of the Bible, basically, and the Bible's texts on this topic. Now, we are at the end of the 60s, and a decisive person, I think, is coming into office, and he's called Jakob Preuß. Jacob, sorry, of course, it's English names now, they're not German names anymore. Jacob Preuss was elected president of LCMS. The major conflicts in his presidency were all related to his understanding of Lutheran orthodoxy and the role of the scripture. We cannot go into too much detail here, but in 1974, a major split happened. 80% of students and 95% of the faculty left Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, the church's central theological school. And this event was called Seminex. In 1976, 150 congregations joined those Seminex professors and students in exile, and a couple of district presidents of LCMS also lost their jobs. What was the main reason for this schisma of the church? Why did it come to this?
Essentially, it was a question of the authority of Scripture and what was being taught at the St. Louis Seminary.
Mm-hmm.
So Preuss, who had not been Missouri Synod, he and his brother came in from the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, a much smaller church body. But he responded to the conservative voices in the Synod who were believing, again, we'll go back to a term we used earlier in the conversation, liberal tendencies.
Yes.
And so as the story moves on, Preuss initiates an investigation. The president of the seminary was fired, and investigates the faculty, and finally the students declared a moratorium on attending classes and demanded to know which of their faculty were being accused. That led to the seminary in exile, as you mentioned. It was called Seminex for short, in which that vast majority of the student population and faculty walked off the campus in St. Louis to a neighboring Protestant seminary and began to create this alternative option. Now, the question at the heart of once that move was actually made, then what do we do with the students who are coming near to graduation and ordination? Does the church body ordain Seminex graduates? And it was around that question that those district presidents, the district in the Missouri Synod is in every case but two, is a regional grouping of congregations. The primary non-geographical district is called the English district, was something my father was associated with. And it was the just historic point here was the group of people who were speaking English and asked the church to let them in, even though it was still speaking German back in at the turn of the 20th century. So these district presidents, 4 of whom were fired for actually declaring and authorizing the ordination of Seminex graduates, that led to this schism in 1974. And the formation of the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, as you mentioned, the 150 congregations who formed. That group eventually contributed a great deal to the formation of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in 1988.
Yeah. Now, this is not the small thing, I think. No? I mean, obviously, it wasn't the majority of congregations and people of the church, but it was a considerable part of those, considerable number of congregations and people who decided to leave the church, and not lightheartedly, I should think. I mean, or it was probably a very difficult decision. Now, one of the documents against which Preuss made these decisions, or used as a discussion basis, is called A Statement of Scriptural and Confessional Principles from 1972. That is still on the homepage, on the website of the LCMS, and I've had a look into this. And please let me just quote a couple of things here for the sake of those people watching in order to know what we are talking about. What were these people confronted with, the professors and the students of the seminary? What is it that you've got to do if you want to play by the rules of LCMS? Yeah, and there's such things as we believe in the verbal inspiration of the actual words of the Bible. That is page 18. I'm rephrasing here, but that is what the document states. The events recorded in the Bible are historical events. Adam and Eve were historical persons. It says that on page 20. We believe in the facticity and the historicity of biblical events, for example, the flood, die Sintflut, that is page 23. And now, I mean, those are things I find very hard to digest, I must say, but now we come to the things that I think are incompatible with scholarly work or what theologians do. And that is, for example, there are never various meanings of a biblical text. There are never various meanings of a biblical text. It says so on page 29. There are no theological or factual contradictions in the scriptures, page 31. If historical methods of interpretations lead to conclusions different from the evident meaning of the biblical text, such conclusions violate the Lutheran view of scripture or commitment to the Lutheran confessions. That is page 39. I'm stopping quoting now, but I mean, I couldn't imagine working with these, how should I say, with these rules in my head, with these censorship rules. I mean, scholars, theologians who are scholars are looking and are researching basically the text and are looking at historical developments, at things. And yeah, this seems to be impossible under these circumstances, doesn't it?
Well, it is agreed. I mean, I find it very challenging to hear what you've just read, and to think about what that means in light of the increase in scholarship and biblical scholarship. But historically, this takes us back again to the founding of the Synod in its early years, when it was a kind of a pugilistic organization, and in one sense, Walther in particular liked to fight, and he fought for the confessional position. And so one of the issues throughout the Synod's history has been the question of fellowship with other Lutherans. And as he was organizing the church back in the late 1840s, there was a group called the Iowa Synod, and they were trying to address the question of, can we meet? Can we talk about some of, we have common confession? But the Iowa Synod believed in something called open questions, which meant that there was no single interpretation.
Yes.
And so Walther could not stand for that, and it became the Missouri Synod belief and an important point of their self-understanding that there were no open questions. This was not something that could be debated. Imagine how that closes off the conversation in so many ways, and it really helps to understand how this church body continued to understand itself as isolate from many other Lutherans over the course of time. By the 1930s, and again, historians do history, so I'm just going to tell you this, add this context to the story. In the early part of the 20th century, there were multiple Lutheran, ethnic Lutheran church bodies throughout the country. And around the time of World War I, these church bodies started to merge. There was a real frenzy of groups coming together to skip to overlook their various ethnic identities and to come together under common confession. This was something that was challenging to the Missouri Synod because it was it had always been an issue. It was something they feared, that it was called unionism, which was fellowship with other Lutherans, and what was required to.
If I may just mention this, this is a bad word in SELK either. Unionism.
Okay. Well, I knew you were going to add that. And so unionism became sort of this flashpoint of the developments in Missouri Synod history. But it as the other Lutherans were organizing themselves into larger denominational groups, the American Lutheran Church in particular was interested in a fellowship with the Missouri Synod, and it was moving in the direction of that actually happening in 1932, when the then president of Synod issued another statement called a brief statement, which shut that whole matter down. By the 1940s, a group of very prominent Missouri Synod clergy came together because they were very unhappy with what they considered a tone of loveless legalism in the Synod that was around this issue of fellowship. And so, again, it's standard practice that groups then issue statements. And this group of people issued something, and it came to be known as the Statement of the 44. It became very divisive in the Synod, but what it did was it outlined, at least it made clear, the divisions between very traditional conservative voices and the more moderate, I'm not going to use terms like progressive and liberal because that's not, those aren't necessarily useful in this conversation, but more moderate voices. And it became a real roiling point within the Synod. The president of the Synod, in his attempt to bring some peace to his church body at the time of the centennial of the church's founding, asked them to withdraw their statement. They did not. They just said they wouldn't talk about it any longer. That rift continued, and it continued into the 60s. So it feeds into what happens at the seminary now, and it becomes critical to the schism of the 1970s. I hope that helps folks understand.
Obviously, if people want more details, they've got to order and read your book. That is very, very enriching, I must say.
They can, yes.
But let's maybe return a little bit to the topic of women's ordination.
Please, yes.
Now, we were talking about this conservative turn, which was a response to long-standing developments in the church, but also to the social developments, of course, to the in the 1960s. I mean, it was an era of liberation, wasn't it? Now, what did women's ordination have to do with that conservative turn?
I mentioned earlier that there was a convergence of many of these various issues in the 60s, and so one thing that it seemed to, the spirit of the time seemed to be doing, was opening up a sense of cooperation. By 1960, there were three primary church bodies in America. The Missouri Synod was one, the American Lutheran Church was one, and the Lutheran Church in America was the third. These three groups decided in 1965 to form a pan-Lutheran organization called the Lutheran Council in the United States, shorthand LUCUSA. And one of the things the Missouri Synod insisted on in the formation of, in agreeing to join that group, was a division of theological studies. So the American Lutheran Church was experiencing an increasing number of women who were enrolling in its seminaries. And they raised the question to this division of theological studies, may these women be ordained? What do we think about the ordination of women? Again, an urgent social press coming in from the outside that is requiring the church to answer these questions. And so in 1968, the theologians in LUCUSA formed a consultation and studied the issue. And they spent a year and a half studying the biblical reasons for and those that prohibited the ordination of women. And in the end, they came up with a some would find an unsatisfactory response, and others would find it a reasonable response. But they declared that the ordination of women was an adiaphora. It was what is known as an indifferent thing, and that it was neither expressly prohibited by Scripture, nor was it required. And so the result of that consultation in 1970, the ALC and the LCA both decided to amend their bylaws and approve the ordination of women, and did in fact ordain the first women to the ministry of Word and Sacrament in 1970. Well, at the same time this was going on, the American Lutheran Church had resumed its interest in the Missouri Synod. We talked about it having happened in the 30s and being shelved at that point. And so they were getting very near to this fellowship agreement when the ordination of women actually happened in the ALC. The Missouri Synod would have none of it. And they said, and the president of the ALC spoke at the Missouri Synod Convention, and he said, this should not be a dividing point for us. But in fact, it eventually was. It was the end of any conversation, because of all of the fear of unionism, that word we spoke about earlier.
Yes.
And it's at that point when there's a tangible action on the part of its, they're not partner churches, but they are in fact other church bodies in which they were in some relationship, that the synod became much more hard-lined about the ordination of women. Now, they didn't stop talking about it. They formed in a conciliatory move towards women. The president of synod appointed some task forces, groups of women who came to study the issue, along with the men of the CTCR, the Commission on Theology. And that went on for in through the 80s. There was some conversation that was going on. In fact, into the up until around 2010, there was still a group that had been asked to meet with the men of the CTCR to talk about the place of women in creation, actually, and then beyond that in the church. But since that time, there has been no discussion. And the women, some hardy souls, continued to organize themselves. A group that you first mentioned to me when we first met, the Ordained Women Now group, that had a website and was making the case that this is not an issue that should be dropped. But in the light of complete resistance from church leadership, there is not discussion of the issue. In fact, last year, the CTCR came out with a publication on the order of creation, in which it establishes that is its basis for understanding there will not be ordination of women in the Missouri Synod. And you find that is, in fact, is how it wishes to identify itself.
It's become an identity marker, hasn't it? The rejection of the ordination of women.
Its social identity is that it's the church body that the Lutherans who don't ordain women. In fact, that is not how they would define themselves. But very often, identity becomes something that is easier to express in what you are not than what you are.
Of course, Now, let me ask you a thing that just came to my mind. We started our conversation by talking about the Congregationalist church polity of LCMS. Now, obviously, by the end of the 60s, at the very latest, all of the major decisions are being made in the Synod, and its advisory character seems to have made place to something very hierarchical and very authoritative, hasn't it? I mean, this seems to be the place where such decisions as can we ordain women is made. I mention this because obviously there is other churches, as for example Southern Baptist Convention, at least until recently, in which the decision was left to the congregations if they wanted to ordain women. And of course, that is also a model that is being discussed in our church, as well as a possible way, a scenario for the future, that we have individual parishes or church districts in which this is possible. So my question was, where has Congregationalism left the church?
That's so curious, because it's proving to be a bit of a problem for the Missouri Synod. Mm-hmm. In the case of some legal challenges that it has met. If it defines itself as advisory, then how can it, and this is one of the cases I'm thinking of, is without mentioning any details, it has to do with one of the Concordia universities. Mm-hmm. But the question is asked, if the Synod understands itself as advisory, then how can it be so arbitrary in its ruling about what this university may or may not do in terms of its own governance?
Yeah.
And that's a very legitimate question. And I know it's one that is perplexing to the Synod. But in fact, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. It is, and so we go back to the beginning. What was founded on board a ship as an episcopacy sure looks like what we're looking at right now in terms of a very clergy dominant church body that is making arbitrary rules and claiming the authority to do so, though congregational autonomy is understood. And so there's a great deal of disparity in congregational practice in terms of the role of women and whether they may participate in worship in certain roles and what they might do. And that's where this is very similar to what the Southern Baptist Convention is experiencing right now. Southern Baptist ordained women up until 1984, when they had a similar conservative takeover as the Missouri Synod did under Preuss. The Southern Baptists had a conservative takeover during that same era, and stopped and declared that women could no longer be pastors. What does that say to a woman who has been pastoring a church? You know, what does that say to the people who have been very happy with their female pastor? But so since that time, some Southern Baptist churches have continued having women as pastors. There's been controversy in some of the seminaries, as you would expect. But most recently, last week, 2 weeks ago, when the Synod met here in Louisiana, when the SBC met here in Louisiana, they took the first step to making this a permanent ban on women in ordained ministry, and congregations who had women as pastors were just grieved over this, and it's beginning to see a lot of people question their relationship to the church body. And what the Southern Baptist, I mean, if you're looking for hope as members of ZELK, you know, you won't find it in the Missouri Synod, but you will find it in the Southern Baptist Convention and people who are be speaking up, but you'll also find it in Pope Francis, who for the first time is allowing women onto the Vatican Council.
Yeah.
And saying that they can have a voice in decisions that are made there. And he has also said that there are issues that are very worthy of being discussed, and that the church should not hold only one answer to those issues. And that's explosive in the Roman Catholic tradition. So it's interesting to see it's an interesting time and a curious time in terms of some changes that are taking place. While on the other hand, there are backward steps being taken by others.
Yes, there are backlashes. I think so too, and I think the, if I may call it, radicalization of Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod in the 70s, basically, is definitely, I should think, a reaction to the liberalization of society in the 60s. And similar things took place elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, it's a development. As a historian, I think you will confirm that you can discern and find in history again and again. But in the long run, I'm sure people will see that the way forward is not to be more divisive and to build a castle and walls around myself and to wall myself in, but to seek for community with other churches, basically, and to embrace diversity because people are diverse. There's no getting around that.
Well, they are. And, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which was the end result of that after the schism of the remnant of Missouri that left and joined with the ALC and the LCA, so formed the ELCA, as it is called, has ordained women now for 53 years. And everything is not wonderful in that regard. I mean, they have a female presiding bishop. They have a number of female bishops. They have a number of female seminary faculty and many pastors. But the stories one hears, the anecdotal history that we hear over time, is that there are still those who wish that was not the case in the ELCA, and who do not support the ordination of women. The same thing is true in the Episcopal Church, and it is, I think, the nature of humans to make a case against something that they have been uncomfortable with.
I guess,
and that's what you see happening.
Now, may I ask you one more thing? What is the situation of the LCMS now, as you see it? I mean, in relation to the ordination of women's, we've talked about that. We mustn't get our hopes high that anything will change in our lifetimes there. Maybe in God's lifetime, if I may pick up on that joke of yours from the book.
Yes.
How is that church developing? Is the conservative strategy and the conservative turn that it took and that it so consistently followed over the last decades, is that a recipe for success?
Well, it has always argued that it has an unmoving theology. That is, it is. I think you used the word changeless earlier in the conversation. And that continues to be a driving force. Like many churches in America, it has lost membership, about a third of its membership in the past decade or more. But how as one who studied its self-identity over time, will remain interested to see how it continues to identify itself in light of shrinking members, in light of aging members. The largest group of Americans with regard to religion now identify as no religion, as nuns.
Yes,
NONEF.
it's the same in Germany, by the way.
And so where is the church looking to gain in the mission field? And how does it understand itself and publicly express its self-understanding? I'm not encouraged because, as I mentioned, the publication of this document on the order of creation last year by the Commission on Theology pretty much drew a red line that this is what we're going to use as a basis for understanding the role of women in the church. And it raises a good question for people. Are they attracting? I don't know. Are they attracting people from more Orthodox traditions, more?
That is, I think this is a decisive question, isn't it? I mean, in the light of shrinking membership numbers, and that goes for all the churches I know. There are few exceptions, maybe some Pentecostal churches somewhere in the world, but not in the US and not in Germany. What do we offer people? Yeah, and obviously the recipe of LCMS seems to be we continue the way we did it the last 30, 40 years. But there have been substantial changes in our history, but we stopped changes, we abolished change, we are now staying exactly as we are. I wonder if that is the way forward. It seems to me if situations are changing, and that goes for my church as well, membership is shrinking, yeah? What do we do? What do we change in order to develop into the future? What decisions do we take? I hope that a little more flexibility is what will come into our discussion here, at least in my church.
Well, I wish you well in your conversation about it, about church growth and about the role of women in the church. It seems a curious place to be drawing a line in light of shrinking membership. That you're, I believe so fervently in that the gifts of God are not gender specific, and that men and women both are gifted to teach and preach. You know, Luther said we should all be little Christs to one another, and that requires a little bit of preaching, doesn't it? If you're going to behave in that way, a little bit of teaching, a little bit of humility along the way. And I wish that things were different in the church body in which I grew up, but it's been difficult to watch that history unfold and to see the steadfastness with which people are opposed to this change, or to change it at all.
Yeah. I mean, we are already looking into the future, but we have got one question from the chat, which I'd like to read to you, if that's okay.
Oh, good. Okay.
No, actually two. First question, and hello, Elke, by the way. Thank you for the question. How did you fare in your church LCMS when you published Authority Vested? Can you say a few words to that, Mary?
I was challenged by a pastor, and I'm not going to take the time here to tell that whole story, but my position as a member of the faculty was challenged by this individual, and I was pleased to be retained on the faculty as a result of that challenge. But it led to my moving on from Concordia to a place that was more receptive to the position that I supported and believed in. I didn't write that book with any intent to, as some sort of manifesto, that the church had to do this. I thought that perhaps we could talk about it, but just talking about it became very threatening to some people.
Yes. Yeah, that is my impression too, from generally speaking, from a very conservative, very traditionalist church people. It's very important to keep the image, yeah, of the never changing, unerring church, basically. Anyway, let's not go into more detail there. I've got another question. Isn't it enough that the Wisconsin Synod exists? Can you, what does Elke mean with that question?
The Wisconsin Synod is a smaller sister church to the Missouri Synod with some even more rigid positions on praying and with other people. And
okay. So that is that.
More history to be learned there.
Okay, I see. Now, Mary, thank you very, very much for this tour de force through the history of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. I think it was very interesting to see our common roots, basically, and how the church is developed. We haven't touched too much upon where they met again in time. We could have elaborated on the fact that after the Second World War, our theological college, die Lutherische Theologische Hochschule, was sponsored heavily by Lutheran Church-Missouri Synod. There have been many exchange students from Germany who've been at Concordia colleges and seminaries. So there continues to be an influx of ideas really from LCMS to SELK, and that influx sometimes leads to let's say developments which I'm not too happy about. I'm just briefly mentioning something that happened a couple of weeks ago. Students of our college organized a talk given by a former or by a retired pastor of our church, which basically said that evolutionary theory was not compatible with the Bible. And the direction in which this is going is clear. It's going in the direction of evolutionism, of creationism, sorry about that. And this is something that we don't, I mean, the statements I quoted earlier from that Preuss document in the 70s, those positions aren't official positions of my church, which I'm very happy about because I couldn't really live with that. This sort of verbal inerrancy, all of the stuff I mentioned. Anyway, I think there's stuff we've got in common with the LCMS, but there's also quite a number of things that we don't have in common, and it's important to keep that in mind, I guess. I think we've made.
Well, you know, the church body that draws lines around itself and says that the biblical literalism is its understanding, its self-understanding. As you read some of those statements from the 1972 document, is a difficult place for many, many people today who are not convinced of that kind of certainty, and are interested to know, is there no other way to understand some of these texts? But that requires asking questions and being allowed to ask questions.
Yeah, I guess. Again, Mary, thank you so much for your time and for the long discussion we've had, not only today, but I may say we've started our conversation via email at the beginning of this year, and it was very enriching for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your wonderful questions, Michael. It's been a pleasure to be a part of your project.
Well, I wish you all the best. I wish you God's blessing for yourself and, of course, also for the church that you are now affiliated with. And let me just say by stating I'm Michael Sommer. I belong to Initiative Frauenordination. We are working to introduce female pastors in our church too, because it corresponds to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the scriptures. Thank you, Mary.
Grace and peace to you, Michael.